So again, good morning and Happy New Year, and I'm glad to see all of you, and let's see if we can do justice to these great lessons, especially the prologue. This is known, the lesson from John is known as the prologue to John. And you know, this is yet again another instance of the early Christian community trying to interpret and trying to understand the relationship of this figure Jesus to the great originating source of the universe, God. And so you get this sort of very clear echo of the beginning of Genesis. In the beginning, but now it is in the beginning was the Word. And what we're asked to contemplate is really the creative impulse of God, which in the works of John, the Logos, the Word of God, goes forth and creates all that is. And so really we're asked to contemplate how God creates the universe. And you know, that's a very live question for us as well. I mean, we think of it in a different cosmological frame. We think of it usually as the Big Bang and how did this universe come into being? And of course, you know, the prologue to John doesn't answer that. It simply speaks of how the creative impulse of God, you know, through whom all things were made, we're saying that energy was fully present and empowered this figure Jesus, the Word of God made flesh. And in a sense, the Word of God is made flesh in all of creation. And when we speak of Jesus, it is the Word of God being made flesh in human terms. And in Jesus, we see what it is like for the Word of God, the creative presence of God, to be active in this human being, Jesus. And a couple of things about that. One, I hear in that prologue a kind of universality. You know, the Hebrew tradition struggles always with the kind of tribal mentality, our God for us, despite all of these indications that the nations shall stream to the light that comes through the Hebrew people. And because we're confused about things, we as human beings usually interpret that to mean there shall be some system of government or a church that will govern everything. And it's not that. I think the closer approximation is maybe found in the book of Revelation, where in the New Jerusalem, everyone is enlightened by God. And there are no temples and there is no need for religion anymore because everyone is really moving by that inner light. And so this is suggestive of that. The light that enlightens all people is coming into the world, which is to say, all of us, if we pay attention, if we listen, if we are alert, all of us have a relationship to that light that is coming into the world. And I think, my theology is quite clear that all creation shares that presence of the Word, the indwelling Word. All things share that creative presence of God, including us. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I think we as human beings are such troubled creatures. We forget so easily that we too are born of the Word of God and have that divine presence within us if we would only listen to it and trust it, which of course we don't, which is of course our ongoing tragedy. And the lessons, the prologue to John is so clearly indicating that Jesus is himself the incarnate Word in human terms. But the lessons for today are also quite interesting as they reflect on our human place in creation. The psalm especially, I love the psalm. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars you have set in their courses, what is man? What is the human person that you should be mindful of us? You have made us but a little lower than the angels. You give us mastery over the works of your hands. So this is the human being put in the context of creation as a steward. And yet I sometimes make reference to this. There is a figure out of the Greek world that I think is a contrast to the Hebrew understanding of our human place in creation, and that figure would be Prometheus, the figure that steals fire from the gods for the benefit of human beings, but then is punished by the gods. The gods jealous, the gods do not want to empower human beings. And how different from that is the Hebrew vision. And you know, one of my favorite gospel passages from Luke, where Jesus says, "Consider the lilies of the field." And you know, God sustains them. Don't you know that God is going to sustain us as well? And that passage ends with Jesus saying, "Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." And how different is that sort of cosmological sense? You know, we are here in a creation that is adversarial, and we will be punished if our powers grow, versus fear not, little flock, you belong here, and the very power of God is at work in you. But how is it at work in us, and is that what we listen to? And I've been thinking too that, you know, we hear the phrase, at least some of us sometimes, that we as human beings are made in the image of God. And it's always a little tricky to sort of, you know, flesh that out and say what that might really mean, because clearly it does not mean a physical image, although that has, you know, from artistic representations, you know, forever, there is that sense that God is like a big human being in the sky, and no, that's not it. But there is something about our human activity that is, in a sense, a parallel of God, and that is the Word becoming flesh, which is what we do as well. Everything in our human world around us, everything we have made, all of our cities, all of our technology, all of that began in our imagination. It began as a thought, and then that thought was incarnate in the world. Now, the trouble with us is that we incarnate our darkness as well. We build a world that reflects our fear and our aggression, our distrust of each other, our acquisitive impulses. We build, but notice, we are world builders. And the world that we build begins in imagination. And then we put that forth into the world and incarnate it. Through us, too, the Word becomes flesh. We are world builders in that sense. And perhaps, again, I'm not going to say that exhausts in any way that sense of us made in the image of God, but it's a creative process. And as the Psalm suggests, it's a creative process that gives us extraordinary dignity, that we have been entrusted with this creative power. And that, of course, is the real crux. We have been entrusted with that creative power. And what kind of world are we imagining? What kind of world are we imagining? What kind of world lives in our imagination so that we can bring it forth and give it flesh? Is it a world still of fear and aggression and more for us and less for others? Or is it the world of Jesus? Is it the world that imagines plenty for all and honesty in our human relations and abundance for all? What kind of world are we imagining? Which does not seem like a bad question to ask on the first day of the new year. The first day of the new year, let us ask ourselves, do we take seriously enough the profound dignity of our human condition? we can easily turn against ourselves and look at us and look what we do, not just now, but in history, and say, as many people do, what a debased creature. Creation would be so much better if only human beings were not here. And that blasphemes against the one who creates us. We're not a mistake. We're not a mistake. But woe, do we lose our way. But our dignity and our calling is a highland. We are made a little lower than the angels, and we too, in the image of God, bring forth a world. May that world that we bring forth from the imaginations of our hearts to the enfleshment externally, may that world reflect the best of us. May it reflect our real receptivity to truth and to love and to God. May it be so, and may we, in this year, fulfill the glorious destiny that is ours as human